Welcome, bienvenue everyone. We're so glad that you're here. I'm going to drop a couple of housekeeping instructions in the chat, so everyone should be able to see it. The first is that you can change your name if you so wish, and this goes for panelists as well. That you can just hover over your the dot over your picture, and then you should be able to click rename. So you can do that if you'd like to identify what organization you're joining us from. The second thing is to please use the Q&A to send questions to the panel. This can be found across the bottom bar. We will answer these at the end of the presentation, and anything we don't get to, we'll follow up with after the webinar over email. And we're not going to monitor the chat, so if you do put something in the chat, we'll have to follow up with this after the webinar as well. So to support a more engaging conversation, at the end of the presentations, the host, which will be me or Linnea from ABC, we will be able to unmute certain participants. And so we'll do that. You can just raise your hand if you wish to engage with us verbally, or we will converse using the Q&A. And if anyone's having any issues with the way the presentations look, we had kind of an issue with one of our attendees in a practice session earlier this week, that the view was off, the aspect ratio. And so if you go up to the top right of this black portion of the screen, a little thing called view will show up, and you can click on that and then adjust the zoom ratio. So hopefully that doesn't happen to anyone, but if it does, that's our fix. And you can let us know in the chat if there's any issues, and we'll try to manage those at the beginning. All right, without further ado, I think I'll yield the floor to Andy to give us a little background.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Crosby. Thank you all for being here. I'm a quantitative ecologist at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, working with the Boreal Avian Modelling Project. And I've been involved with this project since the beginning. Back in, I think, 2018, we were working with SFI on a conservation grant involving birds, and they put us on to working with ABC, the American Bird Conservancy, looking to sort of expand things between Canada and the United States, and combine our expertise to address the analytical side of SFI conservation value for birds, as well as the more applied side of working directly with forest companies and managers to create tools that they can use for bird conservation. And so that was the genesis of this project. And after meeting, we kind of settled on this BCR 12 in the Upper Great Lakes region as the best place to start looking at a cross-border project. And we started planning an in-person workshop, and then the pandemic hit and kind of derailed everything. So back in, it was 2020, we had an introductory webinar that led to a steering committee, and sort of going over the course of several years, or a couple of years during the pandemic, we kind of slowly got things going. And then more recently, BAM, the Boreal Avian Modelling Project, applied for a conservation grant with SFI that led to where we're at now, kind of expanding the project as part of another project. And that's where we're at. I see Sean just joined, and I will let him chime in from the ABC end of things to sort of fill things out a little more.
Hey, thanks, Andy. Sorry for being a little late. My apologies, but welcome everybody. So glad you could join us. Yeah, so just to give you a little background on the cross-border project that we're all embarking on. Little history. I'm not sure how far Andy got, but back in 2018, SFI hosted a meeting in Edmonton, Alberta, with many of the partners that were doing various projects that SFI had supported. ABC, along with the Boreal Avian Modelling Network, were present, presenting on our various projects. And after the meeting, SFI came up with the idea that perhaps ABC and SFI could, ABC and BAM could join forces and bring ABC's boots on the ground field work and our work with foresters together with BAM's modeling work. So we took the idea one step further, and in 2019, SFI at the SFI conference in Richmond, Virginia, Andy at BAM and myself, along with EJ Williams, presented some ideas of how we could work together and develop a cross-border initiative between Canada and the U.S. Everybody seemed to think the idea was warranted, and we put together a workshop in early 2020. And we brought together about 65 individuals from the forest industry, educational institutions, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies, and we brought them together to address the following questions. If we were to hold this type of workshop, one, what bird-related forest conservation issues are of concern or interest? Two, what might we include to shape this initiative to benefit all of our organizations? Three, what bird species should we be focusing on? And four, what forest cover types are of greatest concern or present the greatest opportunities for us? Out of the workshop, we asked those who were present who would be interested in continuing the discussion, and out of that, we had 9 individuals who came together to form a steering committee, and now we've expanded that to about 16 people who are working on it today. And through that steering committee, we've come up with several objectives. First of all, we've come up with a title. The title is Value and Resilience of SFI Forests for Eastern Forest Birds in a Changing Climate. And we developed several goals that we wanted to focus on for this workshop. First is develop and implement a binational collaborative framework for developing and sharing science-based knowledge about the effects of forest management for birds. Assemble spatial data representing forest inventory and management practices in and out of SFI certified forest lands. We also want to evaluate the impacts of past and present forest management on bird populations in SFI certified versus non-certified forests, and also simulate the potential impacts for future forest management on bird populations in SFI certified versus non-certified forests under potential climate change scenarios. The legacy of this collaborative is unique because our idea is to bake into the process deliverables for all of those involved, all the organizations, institutions, and industry that are involved. And by bringing us all together, sharing knowledge has the potential to filter into actual management and or regulatory policies. And with that, I just want to remind everybody, if you haven't already registered for the workshop on October 26th and 27th, please do so now. Maggie's going to put into the chat, it looks like she already did, the link to the sign up. We'd love for you to work with us in person, but if you can't, we've also created a hybrid online option for our October 26th discussion. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Andy and Maggie, who will talk a little bit more about BAM and what they're working on. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Sean. I will check if my screen is being shared.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Presenter mode, there you can see the whole slide now.
There we go.
There we go. Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome, bienvenue to our webinar. My name is Dr. Maggie MacPherson, and I and Dr. Andrew Crosby are going to introduce the co-production framework for this project. Before we begin, we respectfully acknowledge that the University of Alberta and Edmonton are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Saulteaux, Niitsitapi, Métis, Nakota Sioux, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our community. The Université Laval and Quebec City are located on the unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat people. And as you'll see, our planned workshop is focused mainly on Bird Conservation Region 12, which includes Ontario, Quebec, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. We wish to acknowledge that the land on which we work across Turtle Island is traditional territory and home to many Indigenous peoples and nations. And we are working on the appropriate land acknowledgement for the entire BCR 12 area. We'd like to say that what a privilege it is to be presenting to you all today. And we acknowledge that our heritages are those of white settlers. And so the perspectives being shared are necessarily from that background and the privileges that a white settler identity has. We welcome and acknowledge Indigenous voices. In Canada, tomorrow is our National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, where we honor the children who never returned home and survivors of residential schools, as well as their families and communities. In commemoration, you can learn more by exploring information about our National Day. All right, so the overarching problem that we're trying to address for this project is predicting how eastern forest bird populations will respond to sustainable forestry under climate change in the boreal and hemiboreal forests of eastern North America. These areas span multiple governmental jurisdictions and many forest management practices. Here I'm highlighting the bird conservation regions, or BCRs, that cover Canada's eastern provinces and parts of multiple American states. For our cross-border initiative, we're focusing on BCR 12. One way to approach this question is through the lens of sustainable forestry and with partners who have experience and knowledge with these forests and their bird communities. I mentioned that I work for the Boreal Avian Modelling Project, or BAM for short. So what is BAM and what's our role in informing sustainable forestry management? We inform, at BAM, our mission is to inform both regional and continental conservation with a high quality scientific information. BAM's work is the result of strong collaborations in the past and present. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the full BAM team, which is made up of the 4 members of our steering committee on the left of the slide, and academic researchers, project staff, postdocs, graduate students, and government contributing scientists. The contributions of the government scientists as part of BAM's team brings collaboration, and the co-design of projects between government and academia is a major strength of the BAM project. The result of collaborations between the development, has been the development of data harmonization methods that compile a large database of over 180 projects. We thank the individuals and institutions who contribute data, as well as past and current funders, especially Environment and Climate Change Canada, and the institutions that support our team. By assembling enough individual point count data sets, shown in dark red on this map, we've been able to cover most of the environmental space in Canada south of the Arctic. We continue to try and fill in data gaps and to work with partners to support boreal bird monitoring. This large database is the foundation of BAM's model-based approach to research and has allowed BAM to conduct research at scales that are much larger than traditional scales of research. We use these national models to support conservation and management of boreal birds by working collaboratively with a large number of organizations, including the forest products industry, NGOs, and regional and national government agencies. Now that I have painted the picture of how collaborative BAM's work is, let me introduce the steering committee for this project. For our SFI friendly project called Value and Resilience of SFI Forests for Eastern Forest Birds in a Changing Climate, the members of the steering committee have represented the perspective of their organizations for how BAM and ABC execute deliverables to SFI. Collectively, we produced today's webinar because of what the steering committee saw as a necessary introduction to our upcoming October workshop. So why are you listening to me talk about this? And how do I fit into BAM in the cross-border forestry-related bird conservation webinar and workshop? I'm an ornithologist, originally from the far north in Ontario, Canada. And I started out as a young biologist in Canadian institutions before heading to Louisiana for my doctorate. As a scientist, I'm interested in avian species habitat relationships. And here are a few pictures of a few of the birds that I've worked with. Since graduating, I've continued to work on birds, but with more of a focus on bringing people together for conservation action. So I've used a variety of frameworks that I'm going to share with you now that you may be familiar with. This includes building Bayesian belief network models that identify suitable sites for restoration or purchase with taxonomic experts and government. Structured decision making that specifically targets bringing everyone together to make action plans for focal species. Using conservation standards. This framework to distinguish what work can be done and who can do it to achieve our conservation goals. And all of this experience bleeds into the co-production framework that we're using for this project. So to tell you more about that, here is Dr. Andrew Crosby. Sorry.
Okay, so hi again. As I said before, I'm a quantitative ecologist with the Boreal Avian Modeling Project here in Edmonton. And in terms of my background, I've always really been focused on wildlife management and habitat management in the context of forest ecology and management. To the extent that I've made it a point throughout my career to learn as much as I can about forestry and silviculture and understand really what's driving forest management decisions. But the thing I want to touch on here in this presentation is actually my experience during my master's degree work in Oklahoma, where I was working directly with local ranchers on habitat restoration for northern bobwhites, which are a popular game bird species down there that depends on open, shrubby, grassy habitats. And the point about this is that in conducting that research, I really got to know the ranchers themselves. I got to know their properties. I got to know their land management options that were available to them. But I think most importantly, in my informal conversations with them, I really started to understand the kind of the financial constraints they were working under and their priorities when making decisions about how to manage their properties. And as it turns out, this was my introduction to what we now call co-production in the design and execution of research with the intent to inform management decisions. My more formal introduction to this idea was through an excellent paper led by Paul Beyer, I think that's how you pronounce that name, called A How-To Guide for the Co-Production of Actionable Science. And I wanted to acknowledge that there are two main pathways when we're talking about co-production. One very important pathway is developing research in collaboration with local communities and stakeholders and rights holders to ensure that their perspectives and needs and ways of knowing are incorporated into the project from the beginning. The other, which we're more focused on at this point, is what was described in the Beyer paper. The inspiration for that paper was sort of frustration with their experience. I think it was the US Department of Interior in developing climate vulnerability assessments for wildlife that managers could actually translate into management decisions for climate adaptation. And the co-production approach that they describe in this paper specifies that managers work directly with researchers to explain the decision or planning issues at hand, really identify relevant questions, and ensure that the right product is developed to inform the decision-making process. And this approach isn't necessarily something new. A lot of researchers have been doing, some work along these lines to a greater or lesser extent for a long time. But what we're looking to do as part of this cross-border project is to work through the co-production process and really in a formal and systematic way. And in that paper, they explicitly defined actionable science as data, analyses, projections, or tools that can support resource management decisions. And they defined co-production as a collaboration among managers, scientists, and other stakeholders to identify decisions requiring information from research, to jointly define the scope of the problem, the relevant questions, the appropriate methods for answering those questions, and the outputs that would be usable for informing the decisions and developing strategies for appropriate use. And that really sums up our approach to this project from the beginning. I like to think of it as simply beginning with the end in mind, to quote Stephen Covey, which means to begin a project with a clear vision of our desired direction and destination. And I see it as starting by understanding the management applications first, and then working backwards to creating the research design to obtain the necessary ecological understanding, which then allows us to create the analyses, tools, et cetera, that meet the needs of the management application. Which brings us back to the purpose of this project, which is to help inform sustainable forest management for bird conservation in the context of changing climate. And there are a lot of parts to this problem, and we clearly can't solve the whole thing with one project, but the purpose of the workshop, the steering committee, and everything that happens after is to help us decide which part of this problem that we can break off and help push forward a little bit. And also to develop a framework for co-production that could be adapted to other regions, other situations, and hopefully help us to advance our ability to do applied conservation research in the future as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, can you guys hear me? Great. My internet dropped out for a bit. With that, we will shift over to Darren Sleep's presentation.
Bad news, someone has disabled my screen sharing ability. Whoever's got the host control needs to allow me to screen share.
Maggie, can you figure that out?
Every time I try to screen share, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Why don't I just make you the host for now?
That works. Whatever gets us there. Ooh, I'm the host now. Sweet.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right then. Okay, sorry for that minor delay, folks. And thank you again to the organizing committee and for everyone putting this together. I think this is going to be a really good webinar, as well as the workshop to follow. So my title today is Managing at Avian Scales, Forest Management and Best Management Practices for the Conservation of Birds in North America. And it was actually a bit of a challenge to put this talk together because that's a huge scale to work at. So there's pros and cons to that in general. So when I was thinking about this, first I have to say that I'm coming to you from Ottawa right now, and SFI has a very diverse team of staff and consultants that we live and work sort of across North America on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. But here in Ottawa, we are on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And then our other head office, we have two head offices. One is in DC, which is the traditional territory of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway peoples. And as an organization, we are committed to building forest-focused collaborations that recognize and respect Indigenous rights, traditional knowledge, and relationships with the land, and their enduring leadership of forest stewardship and responsibilities for future generations. So I really appreciated, Maggie, your land acknowledgement at the first. I completely agree with it. With respect to thinking about this, SFI is generally known as a standards organization. We are actually a very diverse organization across North America. We have probably the largest group of folks work in the education and community side of things, working with disenfranchised people, including lots of Indigenous nations that we work with, as well as developing educational materials for K through 12 folks, primarily in the US. And here in Canada, we've got a very strong mentoring program that we've developed that are helping people get more connected to the forest around them. I hang my hat primarily in the conservation wing, where I am the Senior Director of Conservation Science and Strategy. Now, SFI engages, as you can imagine, because we're forest product sector, we engage across a lot of different topics, and species recovery, species management, habitat management. That's a big one that SFI engages with, because we do really believe that forests play this pivotal role in the maintenance of biodiversity, and in particular in the maintenance of avian diversity, which is why we partner so strongly with both BAM and ABC across the continent. When we think about the role of certification in avian conservation, given SFI's scale across North America, there's really three ways that we engage our partners and our network in thinking about bird and bird habitat management. We think about the scale we have, which I'll talk about in a minute, the size of our footprint in Canada, in Canada and the US. Again, I have to keep thinking at this continental scale. The requirements of our standard, which apply across all of North America, and finally to the research we do, both as SFI as well as with our partnering organizations, not just in terms of BAM and ABC, but with respect to the certified organizations that are certified to SFI. And I'm going to talk about all three of these things fairly quickly. When we talk about scale, SFI is the largest single certification in the world. We represent roughly 25% of global forest products under one certification. We are roughly 25% of the certified area in the world, sitting at around, I guess I have to move my little window here so I can see what I'm talking about a little over 140 million hectares that are certified to SFI across North America, and you can see that the other standards are on the map as well. But it's important to note that we are one certification standard across North America. So what we say that folks in Northern Alberta have to do is the same thing that folks in Southern Arkansas have to do. So when we think about how that relates to avian conservation, it's not a simple thing to solve. But we have this scale. The bonus to this is that if we make one small change to the standard that affects birds, it affects birds at 143 million hectares. Good. But at the same time, when we're trying to do that work, when we're asking someone to do something, again, in Northern Canada versus Southern US, they're very different ecosystems, very different forests. So there's an inherent challenge to having that scale. Forest certification is obviously directly related to species recovery and conservation. We operate, we have requirements at various different scales from stand and landscape level. We've got this diversity of forest types and age classes that we think about. We have to think about provincial or state conservation planning. We have to think about the role of natural disturbance, which varies massively across that footprint. And then we have to think about what does it mean to be a forest with exceptional conservation value, whether it's a key biodiversity area or a high biodiversity area or an area for particular species at risk. That varies, again, across that massive landscape. And one of the ways we address this challenge is we have this unique requirement within our standard for collaborative research. So that's not just SFI that has to be involved with research, but we require certified organizations, be it Weyerhaeuser, JDI, anyone, Molpus, they all have to be doing research to be certified to SFI. We always like to say that if you are doing active research, you might be certified to SFI. If you are not doing active research, you are not certified to SFI. So it's an important thing. When we think about how these standards are applied, we get back to sort of what we think of as the traditional coarse, meso, and fine filter application of these different things that we put in place. So this is an interesting conceptual concept, but how does it work when we think about a real example? So I wanted to bring up, let's just throw a species at this and see how it works out. So let's talk about one of my favorite critters, Canada warbler. One of these days, I'm actually going to hear one, and that'd be cool. Canada warbler is a neotropical migrant with large North American distribution. It is ranked critically endangered to secure, depending on where you are on this footprint, and it's highly dependent on forests across its entire range. So this is a really, a species that is applicable to SFI at the scale that we operate. When we think about how our standard applies, it's important to know that the SFI standard is outcome oriented rather than prescriptive. And we have to be that way, again, because we've got folks operating in Northern Canada all the way down to Arkansas, over to Florida, over to the Pacific Northwest. We can't prescribe how everyone operates because they operate in such varied landscapes. So we have to say, here's what we need to get to. You figure out how to get there. We collaborate across multiple landowners and stakeholders. So that's not just a certified organization, but it's also conservation organizations like BAM or ABC. We have a very transparent process, and we have criteria and indicators that work at multiple spatial scales. Again, that connects back to that coarse to fine filter approach. Again, if we think about Canada warbler, we have specific performance measures and indicators that are either sort of coarse filter or fine filter. So I've got a cheat sheet here because these are actually complicated things. But for example, if we look at performance measure 4.1, indicator 2, it's requiring certified organizations to develop criteria and implementation of practices as guided by regionally based scientific information to retain stand level wildlife habitat elements such as snags, stumps, mast trees, downwoody debris, den trees, and nest trees. So, that's an example of a sort of a meso applied filter that allows certified organizations to, put practices in place that would hit the species at sort of that meso scale. But we've got requirements in there for the coarse scale as well as, more fine stuff. Now, interestingly, for this particular species, and I searched it up, we don't actually have any fine filter applications within the standard, but that's okay. We do, however, because of sort of indirectly, we require certified organizations to be in compliant with all laws and regulations. So if a certified organization is aware, for example, of a Canada warbler nest, they must protect that to be in compliance with the Migratory Bird Convention Act or the Species at Risk Act. So there is a sort of more fine scale stuff in there, but it is sort of indirect because it's related to legislation and laws. And again, as I said, given this large landscape, the SFI standards provide a lot of flexibility to incorporate local knowledge and expertise, and is very adaptable to all forest dwelling species. That's how it is specifically designed. We want it to be flexible that way, so companies can apply it properly. In terms of how we get better at that, how we learn more about that, we have a research requirement, like I said. So we did $60 million. We didn't, no. Certified organizations did $60 million in forest research in 2020. That's research that they report to us as part of their standard. So, if you're a researcher and you're trying to partner with someone to do good work that is applicable to forest management, talk to forest companies in your area. They have to do research if they're SFI certified. It's a great way to leverage that money. And if we look at that $61 million over, since 1995, we've leveraged that out to $1.8 billion on these various topics. So as a researcher, I get really excited about this. I mean, this is really driving improved knowledge in what we do. So, we carry this forward and we think about how SFI gets engaged directly. Here we have this cross-border bird collaboration project where SFI, we've worked with BAM for quite a while. We worked with ABC for quite a while. And at some point we were like, can we just not plug you two together? Now at the time, Sean was in that meeting. We may have made allusions to, shotgun weddings or something, but in any case, both organizations, we really saw a dovetail between, how they work and what they did. ABC is spectacular at how they engage with people on the ground, and BAM has incredible data and modeling capability. So it just seemed like a real good fit to put those two groups together. So, to wrap this up, I would say that, SFI as a standard, we, provide the assurances of well-managed forests. We make sure things are done well on the ground. That stamp that appears on your products as you're, buying stuff is good. But what I really get jazzed about is how this, in turn, because of the requirements, leans into conservation and conservation research. So, that's how we do. We basically harness this, requirement as well as the funding from that requirement to do better work and to do more work on the ground. Now, with that, I'd like to thank everyone for paying attention or trying to pay attention. I will be in Sault Ste. Marie, so I'm looking forward to meeting more people there and having great conversations. And I will stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Darren. Would you be able to transfer the host to Linnea? Somehow.
Maybe.
If you go
let's
down.
See. Hang on.
Okay.
Make host.
You got it.
Voila.
All right.
Again, we should all be Zoom ninjas by now.
Well, I will go ahead and share my screen. How does that look? All right, so my name is Linnea Rowse and I'm with American Bird Conservancy. I'm the Great Lakes Private Lands Director, and today coming from northern Wisconsin, Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Just to kind of tie into what folks have discussed up until now, I just wanted to share some about an initiative that American Bird Conservancy led with partners in Michigan. The initiative is called Forestry for Michigan Birds, and this is a collaborative approach to help recover forest bird populations. And I'll go through this and we can see how it ties into this cross-border initiative, just as an example of how bird habitat and conservation needs and forestry practices can tie together. A little bit about American Bird Conservancy. We are an NGO or nonprofit organization that is working to halt extinctions and conserve bird habitat and bird populations across the Americas, especially through habitat conservation. I'm working in the Great Lakes region, and most of my work falls into conserving and creating habitat for birds, primarily in the realm of forest management. Most of our ABC staff in the Great Lakes region works in tandem with the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, other partner agencies, including National Forests, Fish and Wildlife Service, and private landowners, other entities like local conservation districts and land conservancies, and many other partners. Partnerships are pretty key to get our work done. So this Forestry for Michigan Birds, it's It's an initiative that we formed in 2018 as in a collaborative way to help recover forest bird populations while also maintaining forest health and sustainable land use. We're looking at this as a coalition, a collaborative approach between agencies, industry partners, nonprofit partners, and looking at it from more of a landscape scale approach. Our audience for Forestry for Michigan Birds is landowners. That includes private landowners, non-industrial, industrial forest owners, professional land managers, and foresters. And to kind of introduce how we started out is we formed a planning committee and a steering committee. Our planning committee and steering committee, as you can see, there's many different members from different agencies, from private companies, private individuals, land conservancies, etc. The planning committee provided direction, technical review, helped build capacity, and helped to make decisions on the direction of this initiative. While the steering committee provided additional technical review, feedback on our product, which I'll get to next, helped to identify additional funding opportunities and outreach opportunities. And we're utilizing the networks of everybody involved here to further spread the message and test this out on the ground as well. So where did we start? In 2019, we held an initial stakeholder workshop, and you can see a couple of the outcomes from different attendees, that there was interest in how can we use forest management to benefit bird species. We can achieve a toolkit to really showcase silvicultural practices and bird habitat needs, and that we are an important part of the solution. Birds' lives matter. So from this scoping workshop, we determined what do our stakeholders want and need, and kind of took it from there. The strategy was broken down into a couple of phases, including identifying forest categories. We broke this down from Michigan Society of American Foresters categories and simplified it into 4 main categories. We looked at what silvicultural options are commonly implemented in forest stands, trying to keep it economically viable so that it is actually something people would implement on the ground. And we identified the priority at-risk bird species to kind of represent these different forest stand types and species that would benefit from tweaking silviculture that is already happening. From here, we decided to create a forestry with birds in mind toolkit, which we developed into 2 guidebooks, one specific for forest managers that has some more technical information, silvicultural information, and one for forest owners that is a little bit more boiled down, shorter version, focusing a little bit more on the bird species and their habitat needs. And this is an idea that came from several other Forestry for Birds initiative. We specifically modeled the Forestry for Michigan Birds effort on initiatives from Maine, New York, Vermont, and some other states as well. So kind of going through these components here, we simplified the essay of forest cover types into forest habitat associations. This can cover some of the benefits of doing it this way is that it can cover most forest, bird, and wildlife habitat preferences. It's simple enough that it can be cross-referenced with other forest type systems used by foresters. Forest landowners can also easily identify their forests using these associations. And it still also lists those SAF forest types. To choose our priority species, and this includes 20 species as our final set here, we collectively chose these species to represent the array of forest types and habitat structures. You can see they're representing from softwoods to mixedwoods to hardwoods, and also birds that utilize different structural areas of forest habitat. Many of these bird species are experiencing steep declines and or have a significant portion of their breeding range in Michigan. So this list does include rare forest bird species such as Kirtland's warbler, also golden-winged warbler. It includes game species like American woodcock, and also species that require specific habitat elements such as snags. So red-headed woodpeckers would be a great example of that. Here's an example from our toolkit booklets, just showing 4 of our priority species here. And initially our species selection, we were initially looking at just the northern portion of Michigan, which is in BCR 12, Bird Conservation Region 12. But we ultimately decided to expand our scope to cover the full state of Michigan, which is BCR 23 in the southern half of the state. So where are we now, or where are we going into the future with Forestry for Michigan Birds? So again, 2018 through 2022 is when we developed our strategy, did a lot of planning. We wrote 2 Forestry for Michigan Birds guides, one for landowners, one for land managers, with those additional technical details. The guides were finalized, printed, and distributed in about May of this year, 2022. We also have it available digitally on the American Bird Conservancy website and also on Michigan Audubon's website. And we'll drop the link in the chat now or in a few minutes. And from here and beyond, we're really focusing on outreach and implementing, getting these forest practices, forest habitat features for birds implemented on the ground. So we're doing a lot of presentations, outreach workshops, sharing materials. We're working on finding additional funding to do on the ground demonstration areas that will be publicly accessible. And we hope to also expand Forestry for Birds to other Great Lakes states. We're starting work on that in Minnesota right now. And ideally, we really want to integrate Forestry for Michigan Birds practices into forest management plans. And I think that's it for now. Here's the link to the Michigan Audubon website where the Forestry for Michigan Birds booklets can be downloaded from. And I'd be happy to take any questions. I think, during our discussion session of this webinar specifically. But thank you for all listening.
Thank you, Linnea. That was great. And Darren, this is going well. We just wanted to note that the webinar and the discussion portion is being recorded, but this discussion portion will be cut from the recording that we'll post later on. So please feel free to be open. And we'll send a link out to everyone after we've edited this recording. All right, I do not yet see, I see that we have many attendees and no yet questions. If anyone would like to kick us off, please feel free. And there's the Forestry for Michigan Birds link in the chat that everyone should see. Were you interested in jumping in, Steve?
Yeah, maybe I could just briefly add a remark, since nobody's charging in, about some broader context for why a cross-border initiative, from my perspective, would be of value. And that has to do with BCRs are supposed to be about setting conservation objectives, setting population targets for a species over the entire extent. It's difficult for a specific tenure holder or single land operator to satisfy a global conservation objective. But another thing that happens is that it turns out that when you expand the spatial extent of your, let's call it planning, but scope of agreement might be a better term in this context, you tend to get better outcomes. So this, one of the consequences, one of the benefits of our regional collaboration like this is that we can develop that agreement together so that everyone feels they're doing their best, everyone's making, pardon me, I'm trying very hard to skate around any idea of coercion or top-down control. And I sometimes don't have the language at hand for that, being an old Stalinist. But what I mean to say is better outcomes can be obtained if we agree on what we want and how we can work with what we have to get there together. And the cross-border thing is particularly challenging because, obviously, so many different jurisdictions, tenure classes, and management objectives to be considered. And yeah, I believe they can be. And I'm done.
Hi, Lisa. I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I really liked what Darren said about the idea that when some of these ideas get incorporated into SFI standards, for example, it has that potential to move beyond a single land base to apply to a very large area. And I guess that's really the big advantage of that kind of process. It's not exactly top down because it's voluntary participation in this thing, but it does give a unifying approach, a unifying target to get to, and it impacts a very large land base. So therefore, it can have, as Steve said, that better conservation outcome because it's operating at a much larger scale. One of the things, though, that I wondered about, that Darren talked about, maybe he could elaborate on this a little bit. I get that because it's over such a large area, you can't be very prescriptive. You can't say do this everywhere because it doesn't apply everywhere. We see in particular a lot of birds that have very different habitat requirements or habitat associations across their ranges. And so what a Connecticut warbler needs in Alberta is very different than what a Connecticut warbler needs in Ontario. And so the way the standard is written, it leaves it very open, the onus is on the companies to understand the science and figure out what it is they need to do to meet the objective. And that's a pretty tough thing to have to do. And I wonder, it seems like this Michigan Forest Guide, for example, is a way that you're narrowing down to what individuals can actually do to accomplish their conservation objectives. But I just wonder how we mesh those two scales. How do we give guidance to individual landowners or individual companies that are trying to meet these targets but don't know how and can't maybe interpret the science, or maybe the science isn't there for that particular area?
Great questions all, Lisa. I would say that SFI has got a kind of an interesting way to look at that, because we do obviously a slight top-down version. If me as the conservation guy is sitting in Ottawa and I write something into the standard that says, we need a program to protect, species at risk, for example. But at a grassroots level, we have what are called standard implementation committees. And these are organizations at either the state level. In Canada, it's more of a regional level. We have a Western SIC, Central, Quebec, and Atlantic SIC. And these are groupings of companies that are certified to SFI, as well as other stakeholders. So they may be academics or other stakeholder groups to get involved. And they talk together, not just about the standard, but about how to do those. What kind of information are they sharing? They can bring in expertise. They can work with BAM, for example. I know that Junior Tremblay has met some of these SICs, and they have said, okay, here's some money to help inform the work we're doing. So there's a little bit of that going on. And then some companies or groups of companies will put together sort of research teams or research bodies to help bring that science to the table. So, for example, I know, Lisa, you're familiar with JDI's got their Forest Research Advisory Committee. That information, all that research that they are doing, gets fed into the standard through the reporting for the research requirements. So that helps them out that way. But they can also take that information and help inform what they do practically on the ground. And other companies do something similar, depending on which company you are. For example, some companies get plugged into an organization like Incassi that has research staff, or some organizations, I'm thinking Weyerhaeuser, they tend to hire a lot of PhD level scientists to work with them to do that sort of work. So every company's got a different way of squaring the circle and making that work. But it does vary by organization and by region.
Yeah, I can respond to that as well. I see that Steve has his hand up as well. I don't know if you were going to respond to Lisa. If I could quickly respond to Lisa as well, then a specific example is one of the pilot projects that SFI helped fund for ABC was a collaborative effort in the Southeast that E.J. Williams oversaw. And through that process, again, a guide was developed for landowners on how to manage their properties for birds. And industry was very involved in terms of how we pulled that all together and what their needs were. And in particular, I'll give you one example. Many of the companies that we work with down there are adapting their management to the different needs of birds, but one in particular, International Paper, with their Georgetown, South Carolina mill, basically, again, as Darren said, they need to develop things differently, but of course, in the US in particular, many of the areas where they're getting product is on private lands, for example. So swallowtail kite happened to be one of the focal species that they're working on down there. And in doing so, International Paper got very excited about changing their management practices to support swallowtail kite. And they went out to those private landowners and said, hey, we have to have sustainable product, and we want you to help manage your forests in a way that allow us to have a consistent product that meets SFI standards. And then, as Darren said, companies are required to have do research on this area. So now we're working with them hand in hand to do the research to see if the practices that we're doing are actually showing increases in population of the swallowtail kite. So it's this wonderful relationship between landowners who own the property where management is going on, industry, and then ABC and other research institutions. So yeah, excellent question though, Lisa.
Thank you, Sean and Darren. Do you want to follow up? Okay. We have another question in the Q&A from Mike Cadman about how is climate change being considered in this? And I think Steve was wanting to answer that question.
Actually, I was trying to just make sure we recognize the question was posed, because that's a big topic, but I have a few very brief remarks that might at least set it up. We use predictive statistical models of bird distribution and abundance based on our database and a whole parcel of covariates. They're climate sensitive. If you can couple that with climate sensitive models of vegetation dynamics and feed them with future climate predictions, you can get a sense of which species are likely to be most affected. And I remember I was working on that in the Northwest Territories. You can assess whether climate directly or indirectly through changes in vegetation or fire regime is the most important factor in controlling bird responses. We found in the Northwest Territories that direct effects of climate were predominant. There's a study about that recently published we can refer you to. That may not be nearly as true in transitional forests such as BCR12. Remains very much to be seen, I believe, although there may have been more detailed modeling studies I don't know of. It comes down to modeling. Some of the ideas are identify the quick responders, the most directly affected species, and one approach that BAM has followed, led by Deanna Strahlberg, is to search for methods for identifying refugia.
Thanks, Steve. I see Darren, your hand is up.
Yeah, I'm just going to riff off of Steve. Steve just provided sort of the research side of how BAM deals with climate change, which is incredibly useful. On the other side, on the forest certification side, we have built into our new standard that came into force January of this year, 2022. We built a specific objective around climate change. We are still, I can tell you that companies right across our network are still trying to figure out how to do this. But the requirement of the standard is such that, first of all, they have to understand the science and understand the risks and vulnerabilities to the forests they manage. So they have to know what climate is likely to do. They have to assess which of those things are, likely to happen and which things are going to have big effects and which things they have actually something to say about, what can they do? And it requires them to develop an adaptation plan to their forests to make sure that they are aware of what's coming and they have got a plan in place to adapt to those changes. On the other hand, the second part of that requirement is we're also requiring companies to look at mitigation potential and what they can do to help mitigate climate change if at all possible. So Can they, apply new silvicultural techniques to sequester more carbon in the soils or in the trees? Can they, change their equipment? Can they use, a better operational design to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from their equipment? So we're getting companies to get very serious about the risks and realities of climate change and adapting their practice and their forest management to deal with that. Now, that's not necessarily going to translate automatically to bird habitat, but it does translate to keeping forests healthy and thriving in that environment in the face of climate change. If that means potentially assisted migration for tree species, sure. Remembering that these folks on the ground, they manage forests and therefore they manage habitat. They don't necessarily get to control where the birds go. I'm sure some of them would love to, but that's not the way the reality is. They manage the forest. So that that climate adaptation chunk to our new standard, we're hoping will really help keep those forests well adapted to their local conditions, whenever they may be.
Thank you, Darren. Well put. Well put. With the we've got another question here in the chat. And engagement is kind of what we're going for here. And so from Bruce Anderson, we have, are the risks of expanding invasive plant species and forest insects and diseases factored into the BAM modeling? And I see that Andy was typing a little bit. Would you like to take the lead here?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how to word the answer there. And Steve, I'm sure Stephen Jr. I think could probably chime in as well, because we all sort of look at different aspects of things. But when we talk about the BAM models per se, what we're mostly talking about to now is say like national scale or regional scale species distribution models in Canada that are using available climate and environmental variables, forest cover variables that are available across the entire area, and getting a snapshot of populations and trying to understand how they've changed as land use has changed. And this is where Stephen Jr. can maybe talk more, because I know other researchers have taken parts of the BAM database to use for more targeted modeling and forecasting, particularly using forest landscape simulation models like Landis. I'm not aware of anyone who incorporated invasive species directly into that modeling. But like I said, maybe Stephen Jr. could chime in.
Junior?
Junior says he's not available. He's in the middle of a conference listening.
Okay.
Well, that's a really tall order. Forest insects, for example. So in Eastern Canada, spruce budworm comes to mind. People have been struggling with how to model the dynamics of that species for a long time. Earliest studies in spatial ecology come down to that spruce budworm in New Brunswick. BAM doesn't do it at the moment. We have discussed how we might begin to try to incorporate natural fire, stand, vegetation dynamics, and budworm in the east, with some colleagues of Junior Tremblay's in mind, and we hope that will go forward. Invasive plant species have not considered, nor diseases. It just opens up a whole array of complex challenges that we haven't tackled yet. Is there a specific one of those that is most concerning to you, Bruce?
We are, maybe we'll get a response from Bruce in due time, perhaps. Lisa, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for some of that, it seems like it might be a bit of a scale issue. Something like spruce budworm, yes, is a very large scale and has the potential to impact very large areas and change population dynamics for entire populations, global populations of things. some of the invasive plant issues and maybe some diseases might be considered a little bit more small scale, and maybe aren't necessary to consider when thinking about regional and national models, but do become important when you start talking about some of that fine scale stuff. Like if you have this invasive plant, if you have this disease in your area, what can you do then to deal with that, and how do we expect that to impact birds? So I think there might be just a bit of a scale issue there, where you're thinking about more stand scale studies that can elucidate sort of what to do for birds in those situations versus that larger scale habitat relationships that are modeled at much larger scales and don't get down into the weeds of small scale processes like that.
Thank you, Lisa. We're over the hour now, and we appreciate everyone who's still here. I know we've lost a number of people, but before you leave, if you're still here, we would like to get to know a little bit more about you, even though we're in this one-sided conversation. And so Linnea has put together a couple of poll questions that we can share. You can go ahead and release those now if you like, Linnea. So the first one is about where you're located. Oh, go ahead, Linnea.
Yep. So this one should go pretty quick. I'll give you 5 more seconds, and then we'll just jump to the next question. And this is about where you're located in the US or Canada. And it looks like we've got about 48% in the US and 48% in Canada, and 4% of our attendees in another country. Unfortunately, we don't have an option to type in your answer with this, but it's very interesting. And we've got 2 more quick questions for you. And the first is, what sector do you represent? So are you working in a federal agency, state or provincial agency, NGO, forest industry, academia, or other? And thank you so much for participating. I know we've gone a couple minutes past the hour. I have 1 more quick question after this one. We'll give a few more seconds here. We have an interesting spread here too. And I'll share the results of this one. So you can all see sort of our distribution here. Many working for agencies, some in NGOs, some in forest industry, some in academia, and a couple in other. And one final question is, we'd like to learn how many years of experience in forest management do you have? And I think too, the discussion that our panelists have been having, this is where we want to launch our October workshop from. It's going to be primarily discussion based and less so us presenting to you attendees. So all right, I will hit stop on the poll here and I'll let you see. But I'm really looking forward to that October workshop. So collectively, it looks like we have a ton of forest management experience, and I think that will really lend to us all participating together in discussion and where we want this cross-border initiative to go. Thank you for answering those poll questions.
Thank you, everyone. With that, I think we'll say farewell for now, and we look forward to seeing you in October.
Thanks, Maggie.
Thanks, everyone.